Hey, Meissner makers, it's Jennifer. It's Wednesday. It's 1 o'clock. It is time for Wednesday workshop at 1. So I don't know about your house, but about this time of year when the weather starts to get so beautiful, I enjoy spending time outside. We have that very bright sun here in California, and it does tend to sort of fade out some of our outdoor textiles. So what I want to share with you today is how to create cushion covers, custom cushion covers for your outdoor patio furniture. So the type of cushion that we're going to look at today, you can see these have spent a lot of time in the sun, are for your dining type chairs. So what I did to start is I took my cushions and I threw them in the washing machine, right, and ran them through a the bulky cycle in the washer. And I did that for two reasons. Number one, to see if was it just dust on the cushions and they were going to look a little better. I figured worst case scenario, if they didn't make it well through the washing cycle, it was okay. They needed to be replaced anyway. But they made it through just fine. They still were looking a little dull and a little in need of a facelift. So if you are facelifting your cushions, you do want to be sure that you select an indoor or an outdoor fabric for maximum longevity. I have some that were out there that were made from an inside fabric, and they just don't hold up as well. So you'll wash your cushions, because we want to work with a clean cushion anyway if we're going to be covering them. And you'll want to choose some outdoor fabric. When you're choosing your outdoor fabric, how much you need is going to depend on the size of your cushion. You need enough fabric to cover the front and the back, right? Plus seam allowances. So I'm going to let you measure your cushions to determine that, all right? And I'll show you where to measure the cushions in a moment. Now, when I went looking for my indoor-outdoor fabric, or my outdoor fabric, excuse me, I found this fabric that I absolutely loved. So two things I want you to notice about the fabric. Number one, it is kind of directional. Now, while the animals are going in both, facing both ways, it seemed to me that more of them were pointing in one direction than another. So I did opt to work with it as a directional fabric. The other thing that made me very sad when I found this fabric, because I loved it, was there was not enough to cover all of my cushions. So that meant I had to come up with another solution. So what I chose to do was select a coordinating fabric to use for the back of the cushions. So now, in fact, what I have are reversible cushions, and I ended up with enough of this fabric to be able to cover all 8 of the chairs, okay? So how do we figure out how much fabric we need, and then how do we cover this cushion? All right, home deck, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. As a rule, is not my favorite thing. But this I found to be quick, easy, and it didn't feel like a home deck project. All right, so we're going to take our clean cushion, lay it down flat. Now at home, you're going to be doing this without all of the other stuff underneath. Flat means flat. Take our tape measure and measure from the side seam on your cushion. Wrap the tape measure around, and don't pull this tight, right? You want to have a little bit of looseness in here. Around to the other side, minus 22 inches. So if I were measuring for the fabric for the top of my cushion, I would know I need to finish at 22 inches, but I also need a seam allowance on each side. I'm going to work with a 1-inch seam allowance. And the reason for that is if I end up if my measurements were slightly off, or my sewing was slightly off, I have an inch to work with. If my cushion's a little too big, I can make it that seam allowance a little deeper. But if it's a little too small and I've only allowed myself a 1/2 inch, let's say, then I don't have much wiggle room to go back and to adjust that cushion. And outdoor fabric is not your least expensive fabric to work with. So if I can avoid making an error, I'd rather avoid making that error. So 22 is where I need for it to be finished. For my cushion then, I would cut a 22-inch wide by, let's see, top of the cushion, we're going to come down. My cushion is measuring 39 inches long. Now I want an inch at the top, so that takes us to 40. I want about 3 inches at this end for, again, the same reason. But here, there's a little bit more room for error, right? Because when we fold that cushion back up, we need to make sure that we've allowed enough slack that it doesn't pull when someone sits down on that cushion. So I'm going to go with about 4 inches, the total length, plus about 4 inches, 5 if I'm feeling really nervous, 5, actually I would probably go from 39 to 45 because I can remember 45. It's an easy number, right? So I'm going to cut 24 by 45. And I'll do that for the front and the back. Now before we get into construction, another tip, kind of an added bonus. First, I thought it was, a sad thing that there wasn't enough fabric for the lemurs to go on the front and the back. But then I started thinking up all of these reasons why that was great. First of all, they're just great on their own. Second, when I have it turned this way, now it's much more elegant and sophisticated. But I could also come back with my scan and cut, and I could add a large monogram or some other type of summer element to this side of the cushion, right? So now I have cushions to match multiple how I'm feeling that day or what type of a dinner party I might be hosting, okay? All right, so we'll have a front and a back cut of our fabrics. The next step, if you've made a pillowcase before, this is going to be so incredibly familiar to you. I will then sew. We're leaving the bottom edge open. If your fabric is directional, make sure you're paying attention to that. We're going to sew up the one side, across the top, and down the other side with that 1-inch seam allowance, because remember, that was what we allowed for on each side. Now, I missed a step. Truth of it, this is actually how I stitch them, up the side, across the other side, and down the third side. And then I put the pillowcase on the cushion. I did that so that I could adjust that seam allowance, make it a little bigger or a little smaller if I needed to. Now, once you've done that, you do need, where did I put my straps? You do need your straps to secure the cushion to the chair. Otherwise, you're going to be picking it up off the ground all the time. If you feel super, super confident before you sew those sides together, you can put your ties in at this point. I went ahead and stitched all the way around, and then I opened up the seam allowance and slid the ties in and tacked them down. That way, I didn't have to worry about losing length on those ties if I needed to adjust the seam allowance to accommodate the thickness of the cushion, okay? Now notice also that the cushion is not super, super tight. You need to have a little bit of give so that when someone sits on the cushion, they're not straining the fabric all the time. If you're taking your time to sew your cushions, you want them to last. Okay, let's get these out of the way here so we can find our ties. We might have to make new ties. There they are. Here are our ties. Our ties are super fancy. These are nothing more than strips of fabric that have been folded in half and then the ends in half again, and I'll show you how to do that. So once you've made sure that your cushion cover is the right depth, you would take your seam allowance, open up a little gap, slide your ties to the inside, and then stitch back over, okay? Now, how do you know where the ties go? On your original cushion, I've cut my ties off because I didn't want that bulk underneath. So you look to see where those ties were. There was one here, and that's where your ties on your new cushion go. So just look to see where the originals were. All right, then the next thing we're going to do is box the corners at the top. Now this is an optional step. I like the boxed corners because it gives a little more definition at the top of the cushion and helps keep everything nice and crisp. So we go to the machine, I'll show you how to do that. Once we have boxed the tops, we will then take our cushion cover, turn it right sides out. Now, outdoor fabric doesn't press super, super crisply, but I would still run the iron over everything just to give it a little bit of a finish. Okay, so here's our giant pillowcase. At this point, we would insert our original cushion into the case. And then remember, you left a nice long length at the bottom. So we'll get this slid inside, and then we will turn the ends both to the inside, and then either pin or use our clips to hold this in place, and then we'll take it back to the machine and sew across the bottom. Okay, so quick recap. Measure the width, add 2 inches. That gives us an inch seam allowance on either side. Measure the length, and I would add 4 to 5 inches. That gives you an inch seam allowance at the top, and it gives you ample at the bottom to turn those ends under and stitch them together when they're finished. You may choose to either place your ties in the seam allowances as you sew that first pass, or go ahead and stitch that first pass, test to make sure that it is the right width for your cushion, and then open up the areas in the seam allowance where you need to slide those ties in. Either method is acceptable, whichever one you're most comfortable with. Where the ties go is going to be determined by where you cut the ties off your original pillow. Probably one at the top, and then one maybe 3 inches up from the halfway point. Because when it's attached to the chair, you need it connected here and here. You want it connected here and here. Okay? So once that's done, we'll box those top corners, turn everything right sides out, insert our old cushion into our new cushion case, turn those edges in, pin them together, and then we're going to top stitch all the way across to finish. Okay, let's head to the machine and take a look at one method for creating our ties and how to box those corners. All right, so we're going to create our wandering ties now so that you can see how to do this. And of course, obviously they can be used for your cushion ties, but anytime that you need to create this tubular type of a tie. These are not bias. There's no reason to cut them on the bias. And as we've discussed several times, my fabric was, there was a very limited supply, so I didn't want to use bias cuts. I just used a straight cut. Outdoor fabric, it's got some heft to it, right? So you could run it through a machine bias binder, but I just felt for the weight of this fabric that I would fight less with the machinery by using just our regular old-fashioned clover bias tape maker. So you're going to cut your binding for the size that you need for the bias tape maker that you happen to have. This was the largest one I had at home, which again, for the thickness of that outdoor fabric, seemed like the right choice. I didn't want to spend a lot of time fussing with the fabric to create the ties. So I'm inserting that fabric into my clover tape maker. And again, because it has some thickness to it, you're going to have to help it through. Let's cut that at a sharper angle. The sharper that angle is that you cut, in theory, the easier this is going to be to feed through to get it started. In the privacy of your own home, do have your larger household iron. Your mini iron is probably not the best option for creating your binding. Okay, so as it comes through, what my binder does is it's going to fold that fabric essentially in thirds. It's folded the outside to the halfway, the outside to the halfway. I would then pin it, if you have enough length, on your board at home. Outdoor fabric doesn't hold a sharp crease. So once you've pinned it in place, there we go, I'll run the iron over it and pull the binder. Now you can see it is rolling back up a little bit, and that's just the nature of this type of a fabric. I'm not going to worry over it because I've got enough of a crease in there that I can see where I'm going. And we'll continue the rest of the way down our length of fabric for the tie. Okay. And then we'll take it and fold it back in on itself. And this is where I like my clips, because this is a fabric with some heft to it. It's a little easier to use the clips than it is to try to pin through. How many clips or how far apart depends on your fabric. If you have some best press, that's going to help to crisp it up a little bit, but still don't expect a perfect flat crease when you're working with an outdoor fabric. You do want to thread your machine with a polyester thread. This is not a place to use your cotton thread. Remember, these are going to be outside. Cotton deteriorates faster than polyester does, okay, and you want your cushions to hold up. All right, so we now have our ties folded and prepared to sew. I'm using an edge joining foot. Edge joining foot has that lovely wall or guide, and it has an open space where the needle lives. I want that open space so that my needle can be moved from side to side so that I can adjust it to get the stitches exactly where I want them on the edge of my binding. So I'll place the binding with the folded edges, the multiple folded edges, or I guess I should say the open side, up against the guide. And then I want to move my needle position over into the fabric itself. I need it to be far enough over that it'll encase those edges and basically seal them where all the folds are here, but not so far that it's all flappy on that one side, right? We're kind of doing a little top stitching to hold everything together. I am going to slightly increase my stitch length. Most machines have a default stitch length that's meant for a medium weight cotton, okay? We're sewing with something a little heavier. It's not a bad thing to have that shortened stitch length, but I just think visually something a little longer just looks, I just like the way that it looks. I think the aesthetic is better. Okay, remember to move those clips as you approach. And we're just letting the folded edges ride along the flange on our edge stitching foot. You could use an edge stitching foot that has the guide on the outside edge as long as you can move your needle position enough to be able to get that needle just biting into the fabric. You're using the flange to position your fabric, and you're needing that open area inside to be able to move your needle around. Okay. So our ties are completed, and we would insert them into those seams coming down the sides on our cushion. Now, the other technique that I wanted to share with you was the boxing of the corners. How do we do that? Okay, we have our cushion case. We have sewn up the three sides. we have inserted the ties into those seams in order to create the boxes at the corner. Now this is something that you might want to use if you're creating tote bags as well. I like a tote bag that has a nice flat bottom, and by boxing the corners at the bottom, that's what's going to give you that squared off flat edge. So once we have this done, you're going to take, this is the top of our cushion, or it would be the bottom of a tote bag if we were making the tote bag. You're pulling the fabric away from itself so that you can line up the side seam and the top seam, or the bottom if it's a tote bag. You're wanting to line the two seams up. So I'm pushing through the point, and I can feel underneath where the ridge for the seam on this side is, which would be, in the case of our cushion, the top seam, and the side seam. Okay, this doesn't have to be exact, but get it as close as you can. All right, once I do that, I'm going to put a clip in the point. Now the next step in boxing a corner is to sew this direction, so you're creating a little triangle. But where do you sew, and how do you know how far down to sew? How big do you want that box, right? So I wanted a 2-inch box at the top of my cushion. So what I need is to end up with a 2-inch to sew where it's 2 inches from one side to the other. So that would be, in this case, right here. So we're at 2 inches. This is where that stitching line goes. I'll use my chalk marker. Take it to the machine. Oh, put your regular pressure fit back on. Just a straight stitch with the needle back in the center position. And we'll stitch along that line. Okay, so we've sewn a little triangle. Our triangle is 2 inches from here to here, so that's going to give us a 2-inch box in our corner. So now when we turn this right sides out, you can see that it's created that nice little boxed edge. How cool is that? All right, nice way to elevate your projects. I don't trim anything out from that boxed corner. For something like this, I like leaving that little triangle in there. I'd point it to whichever side is the bottom or the top. Whichever side you're needing to box out is the way that I would point that triangle. It just helps to keep that edge nice and crisp. Okay? All right, so let's insert that pillow back into our new cushion cover and take a look at what we do for that final stitching. So I have inserted my old cushion into my new cushion cover. And notice we have our little box corners up here at the top. Our ties are in, they're all in the right spots. The ones on the sides are slightly up from where that cushion bends, so it will stay nicely on the chair without any undue strain when someone sits down. So final step, we're going to turn that end under, turn the back under, them as even as possible, clip them. I'm not worrying about boxing them at the bottom end of the cushion. I just want it to be flat and not bulky. If you box them at the bottom, depending on the height of the person sitting in the chair, you can tell that this is a problem that I've had. You may find that that boxed edge adds a little bulk right where your legs are, and so it's not super duper comfortable. So we're after comfort. Turn those edges up. And I want them just slightly longer than the original cushion because, again, when we have someone sit down on the chair, we don't want to put extra stress or strain on any of the seams. We don't want to have to go back and mend our cushions. All right. Once this is done, I would go back to the machine, put that edge stitching foot on, move the needle just to the inside, let the little wall on that edge stitch foot ride right along the outside, and just give this a little top stitch all the way down. And then we are ready to take this out to our patio and have a completely new and fresh look for our outdoor dining. Great place to have a cup of coffee in the morning and read through your new sewing magazines or look through Pinterest for your next project inspiration. So we hope you have enjoyed today's edition of Wednesday Workshop at 1. Questions, comments, suggestions, you can find us at info@meissnersewing.com. We'll see you next week.